You ever climbed a mountain? I've never really climbed a mountain. Well, in the real sense of climbing a mountain, for example, like doing the rock faces up in I think there's rock faces up in Welsford, aren't there? You can climb up. I've never done that kind of thing at all. I've never done the Mount Everest kind of mountain climbing, but I have gone up mountains that have trails up to them and or roadways up to the top of them. I've done that. I've climbed Mount Carleton in the northern part of the province. Daryl, you were there with that. We did that one time. Clayton, we've climbed up Mount Carleton kind of thing. I've done Mount Champlain Mountain up here, where all the antennas are, about back of Brown's Flats. I walked up there. Well, Clayton, you and I walked up there one time, a long, long time ago. I remember that. We got to stop meeting like that, Clayton. So, and what's the little mountain behind Welsford? Is that Douglas Mountain? Yeah. So I've been up there, but all of those, I've never done Mount Katahdin. I know Heather's done Mount Katahdin, and Daryl, you've done it, and. You've okay. Anybody else done Mount Katahdin? Chris Lawrence, you've done it? Oh, there you are. I've never done that, but I assume there's a trail going up there that you follow. You're not doing the rappelling and all that kind of stuff. So I've never done that. But you know as well as I do that it's challenging. It's challenging to climb up a mountain. And really you should actually be in pretty good shape if you're going to do that, because when you're walking uphill, you have forces working against you. You have gravity working against you. It's relatively easy to climb downhill because gravity is working for you, but when you're going uphill, gravity is working against you. And the journey is much harder. It takes a whole lot more energy to go uphill than it does to go downhill. And I think that for all of us, life has the feel many times of an uphill journey. Would you agree with that? It has the feel of an uphill journey. And I'm talking here just about normal life. I'm not talking about abnormal, just normal life. Uphill in the sense that it just takes energy and effort to live the life that God has given to us to live. It takes energy and effort to get up and go to work in the morning. It takes energy and effort to raise your kids. It takes energy and effort to go to work. It takes energy and effort for kids to go to school and to do their homework. And it takes effort to do those things. And if you don't give energy to those things, if you don't give effort to those things, then you just don't have that life. There is some kind of force in this life. There's a downward pulling force in this life, a predisposition in this life somehow toward decline and toward decay and toward chaos, that like gravity in the physical world, it pulls against this life that we are living. And we have to push against that. We have to exert effort against that kind of thing. Otherwise, we will descend into whatever it's pulling us into. The example I often use in this is your house. You know, you build your house and you're living in your house, but your house constantly requires upkeep and maintenance. If you don't do that, if you don't put effort into that, then what's going to happen to it? There's a tendency to decay. There's a tendency, it'll rot right out from underneath you. That's what it'll do, kind of thing. So that's the principle. We have to work at everything. And that's just for normal life in this world. We have to work at it. But then sometimes, and you know this as well as I do, we have to work harder. We have to work a lot harder. There's another mountain that I climbed one time. This one was in Nova Scotia. It was called Moses Mountain. I don't think it was Sinai or anything like that, but it was called Moses Mountain, and it's just outside of the town of Windsor. It's about, if you head toward the south shore, it's about 10 kilometers toward the south shore from the town of Windsor. I was associate pastor at the Windsor Baptist Church at the time, and we had a Christian Service Brigade group in that church, 15 to 20 boys in the Christian Service Brigade, and we had planned a 2-day camping trip up on the top of Moses Mountain. I remember the date. I remember it exactly. It was May the 21st, 1980. And I remember that date because Sarah was born that day. And she was actually born early in the morning. What time was it in the morning, Tawa? 3:28 in the morning. Sarah was born on May the 21st, 1980. And so I was at the hospital with Tawa for that time as Sarah was being born, and then came home and had to take these 15 or 20 boys up Moses Mountain and for camping over that. So I was right in my prime, ready to do that kind of thing. So there's no trail or there's no roadway up to the top of Moses Mountain. To get there, you just have to get out of your car, enter into the woods and make your own way up the side of the mountain to get there. I had gone up the day before. I had gone up to scout out where we might pitch our tents in a place where there's actually some level ground and where we could also, on the edge of things, see the town of Windsor. If you were up there at the top, you could see Windsor 10 kilometers away. So I was looking for that. So that's what I went up to do. And, if you can imagine this, I also went up that day to carry some water up there to leave so we could have water. Everyone was going to bring their own, but I was going to take this 5-gallon jug of water up to the top of that hill. You know, it's one thing to climb a mountain just by yourself, with yourself. It's another thing entirely to have 5 gallons of water strapped to your back when you're doing that. That's 40 to 50 pounds extra to get up to the top of that mountain. And it takes a whole lot more energy. And you get tired a lot faster. And you get worn out a lot faster. And that's exactly the way it is in this life that we live. You know, you and I can be doing fine or relatively okay with the regular burdens of life. And everybody has burdens. Everybody has the regular burdens of life. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't be human. I'll get to that in a minute. But then sometimes things happen. Sometimes things come along and the burdens you are carrying become 40 to 50 pounds heavier because of this that has happened or that is going on in your life. And it takes a whole lot more energy just to keep going. Bonnie, you would probably identify with that in terms of your testimony today. The last time we met here was March the 15th of this year. It's been 16 weeks since we have been here. And here's my sense of what has happened in those 16 weeks, in those 4 months. It's that through circumstances that are beyond our control, our lives, our souls are carrying a load that is, 40 to 50 pounds heavier than it was at the beginning of March or in the middle of March. We might not even identify it as that right now, but if you sit back and look at it, it's like, oh, there's a weight we are carrying because of what's going on. And it's not because of anything we have done. It's through circumstances that are beyond our control. Why do I say that? I say that simply because so much has happened. So much has happened in our world in these 4 months. Things that have, I think, a cumulative effect, burden-wise, in our hearts. There's the COVID thing itself. That's why we had these past 4 months. The fear that's associated with that, the fear of contracting the disease, the changes that we have had to make in life, the restrictions that we've had to abide by, the things that we have had to give up, the people we haven't been able to see, the fears that we have with regard to our business because it's going to fail because we don't have the business or we've lost our employment, like all of that kind of stuff. And that's just COVID, but it's more than the COVID thing. There seems to have been like a perfect storm of realities that burden our hearts and our minds and our lives that have come our way over these past 4 months. For example, the mass shooting in Nova Scotia where 22 people were killed. The tragic loss of 6 lives in that Canadian Forces helicopter crash off of Greece. Even Captain Jen, what was her name? Captain Jennifer, anyway, with the snowbirds who was killed out in British Columbia. The murder, more recently, the murder of Floyd George in the United States. The resultant protests against racism, systemic racism that is there in that country. Then the hijacking of those protests, those peaceful protests in the United States by violence and extremists. The anarchy that seems to be growing in our neighbor to the south and really all over the world. Closer to home, the deaths of Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi here in New Brunswick. And the issues that has brought up and caused us to face in our own country, in our own province, and that is the systemic racism toward Indigenous people. A lot has come down the pike these days. Wouldn't you agree? A lot has come down the pike. It's like, what's going on in our world? What am I supposed to do with all of this? How do I process this? And at a fundamental level, I think we feel the weight of that. There's a weight in a burden in our lives about that. And that gets added to what's already there. That gets added to what's already there from our normal lives. People, are carrying heavy loads just in their personal lives. There are people All kinds of people for whom things are just not going well in their lives right now. And they are burdened by that. There's tough stuff. There's tough situations they're facing. They're carrying heavy burdens. And that may be you today. That may be me today. That's probably all of us in a particular way. Hasn't been a good half a year in many ways. So let me ask you this morning. Here's the title of my message. How heavy is the load that you're carrying? How heavy is the load that you are carrying? I want everyone to close their eyes right now. Everyone to close their eyes. Matt? Sorry, Matt. I'm picking on Matt. I want everyone to close their eyes. And what I want you to do is I want you to picture in your mind a continuum, a continuum with 1 on one end of it and 10 on the other end. So it's a continuum from 1 to 10. 1 represents no burdens at all. For you, life is easy. Everything is going just as you want it to go. It's great. You have no concerns, no worries. Everything's 100%. That's 1. 10 is this kind of thing. If one more thing happens, if one more thing comes into my life, I'm going to snap. I just can't stand anymore. That's 10. Here's the question I want you to think about right now. Where would you place yourself on that continuum? Think about it for a minute. Okay, you can look at me now. As much as you might not want to, but you can look at me now. I have 2 questions for you. I want you to raise your hand. Question number 1. Did anyone place themselves at 1? No problem, no worry, everything just fine. Raise your hand if you did. Didn't think so. Didn't think so. All right, second question. How many of you placed yourselves somewhere between 5 and 10? I thought so. You see, sometimes the burdens that we carry, the realities that are before us, the things that we are forced to deal with, they can be quite overwhelming. And we just cannot get away from them. So I want to address 2 questions this morning, and they are these. What can I do with those burdens? And then what can I do about those burdens? The first question has to do with your own health, your own well-being. What can I do with them? The second one has to do with actions that you can take dealing with the issues that are causing the burden. What can I do about them? What can I do about them? 2 different questions, but important questions. And I want to point to 2 things that Jesus said that I would suggest help us in answering those questions. Just 2 things that Jesus said. So first of all, what can I do with the burdens? What can I do with them? This is the self-care question. This is the question that comes up that actually admits that the burden is heavy and that you need help. The question that admits that you're carrying 40 to 50 pounds of weights on your back that you hadn't carried before, and you're struggling to get up the mountain. So what can you do with that burden? Well, here's something that Jesus said that I think instructs us on this. It's familiar to you. It's in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. But I want to unpack it a little this morning, a little bit, in a way that you might not have seen it before. Jesus said this. He said, "Come to me," listen to him, "come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." There, friends, is a promise for rest. Doesn't that sound good to you? Like a rest for your soul. That's a promise for a rest to the soul of the person who is overwhelmed by burdens or who is dealing with a lot of burdens. Come to me, Jesus said, I will give you rest. Did you know? Are you hearing that this morning? Are you hearing that you can have this rest that Jesus talks about? That's a promise. Do you believe that? You can have this rest. You can have it. But let me talk about what it looks like. Let me talk about what you do when you come to Jesus. with your cares and your burdens. We have this worship song that we sing here often, and it goes something like this. I cast all my cares upon you. You know that song? I lay all of my burdens down at your feet. And anytime I don't know just what to do, I will cast all my cares upon you. Now you're going to be humming that all the rest of the day because I said that, okay? This song, by the way, echoes the most common understanding, the most common picture that comes to our minds, to the minds of believers, when we talk about coming to Jesus with our burdens and our cares. And the picture that comes to mind is this, that we come to him and we do what? We give them to him, right? We lay them at his feet. And the narrative goes something like this, that when we do that, or if we do that, if we're able to do that, and really trust Jesus with them, really give them to him, leave them at his feet, not take them back and start worrying about them again or fretting over them again, then we will have that peace that passes understanding because the burdens will be gone. Is that fairly accurate as to our thinking on that? Are you with me? Sound fairly? Okay, all right. That's the kind of narrative that we actually teach on that type of thing. To use the mountain analogy, it's like me having the burden of getting that water to the top of Moses Mountain, but then going and asking Archie McCaskill, and yes, that's his real name, but going and asking Archie McCaskill because he's much stronger than I am, he's more rugged than I am, asking him if he will take it up, placing the 5 gallons before him, and him saying, yes, I will do it, and him taking it up to the top of the mountain for me. That's what that picture is. But I have a problem with that picture. Actually, I have 2 problems. The first one is a personal one, and it's very simply this. I have never, ever been able to do that. You know what I mean? I have never been able to give any burden to Jesus and come away being 100% free of that burden. When I come away, I might be different, I might be a little, but I've always come away with a portion of it, a part of it. It's still there, it's in my mind, it's part of my life, it's part of what I'm dealing with. I've never been able to come away 100% free of that burden. And by the way, neither have you. And if you tell me that you have, you're lying to me. Because you never have been able to do it. And I also think this, if we're expecting actually to be 100% free of the burden, then we're setting ourselves up for disillusionment or disappointment or maybe self-condemnation, because you know how the saying goes in Christian circles, well, if you just had more faith. And worry and faith are not together, so worry is a sin, and so if you just have more faith, you know how that goes. That's part of the story too. So that's one problem I have with that narrative. The second problem I have with that narrative is that Jesus doesn't teach that in this passage. Doesn't teach it at all. As a matter of fact, he teaches just the opposite. Just the opposite, or seems to. See, he doesn't say here, come to me and offload all of your burdens at my feet. He doesn't say, come to me and divest yourself of all of these burdens and I'll take them and you'll be free to go. He doesn't say that at all. Actually, what he says is, come to me and take on this burden. Take this yoke upon your shoulders and bear it. Take my yoke upon you, he says. What's that all about? What's he talking about here? What's the dynamic? Well, if you put it in context, when Jesus was speaking to the people that he was speaking to there in that time, really the context here is Jesus talking about the burden of the law that people were carrying. Because that's the way they did it. The burden of trying to be righteous before God through their own efforts to keep the law. That's the Jewish way. The law was perfect and they needed to keep it perfectly. And yet they couldn't. That's why it was such a burden. That's why, and Jesus is saying, you have that yoke on you, get rid of that, and take upon you my yoke. And Jesus' yoke is this. It's the gift of righteousness before God through faith in Jesus. And then the Holy Spirit putting that word, that law in our hearts so that it comes from the inside out rather than the outside in. That's what he's talking about. That's the context of this. Be free. He will give us rest from that burden of trying to be righteous, completely righteous before God, because he becomes our righteousness. So that's the focus here. It's the burden of righteousness, but the principle applies to all kinds of other burdens as well, all of the other burdens. And the principle is this, that with those burdens, we are called to be yoked with Jesus in carrying them. To use the water analogy again, it's not for us to carry those 5 gallons of water up the hill ourselves. It's not for us to lay them at Jesus' feet so he will carry them up for us. No, it's to come to Jesus and take him up on his invitation to hitch up with him. That's the yoke. Take my yoke upon you. If you can picture a yoke of oxen, it's to yoke up with him. It's to take up his offer to partner with us in the journey up the mountain. It's to partner with him getting that water up there, and maybe he will take half of it and we will take the other half. Maybe he will take 75% of it and we'll take 25%. Maybe he will take 99% and we'll take 1%. It depends on the need, because Jesus knows our need. But my point here, friends, is this. It's not to give it all to Jesus in the popular way of thinking about that. It's to partner with Jesus in the bearing of that burden. Because, friends, we will always have the burdens to carry. We will always have part of them to carry. You're never going to be free of them. We were never intended to be free of them in this world. Paul says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 2, he says, first of all, to carry one another's burdens. And then in verse 5, he says this, each one should carry their own load as well. We have burdens to carry. Jesus himself was never without burdens on his heart. As a matter of fact, he carried the weight of the world on his heart. So I'm just saying that to expect to be burden-free in this world is unrealistic. To expect to have Jesus bear all of our burdens for us is unrealistic. But to expect him to bear them with us is the way of the kingdom. It's the way of the kingdom. That's the way it was back in the Garden of Eden. You remember? That's the way it was intended. Remember, when God placed Adam and Eve in the garden, when he created human beings, he placed on their shoulders the burden of managing this world. But they weren't to do it alone. They were to do it walking with God in the garden. That's the way it was intended. Does that make sense to you? Okay. That's what we can do with our burdens. Secondly, I want to say this, or ask this question. What do we do about the burdens, okay? Just very quickly. Second question. What do we do about all of these real issues that are a part of our world today, for example, a part of this perfect storm that we're in? Or what do we do with all of these real life personal issues that we as individuals are dealing with right now? And I have to say, I'm not sure I have a definitive answer on that. Not at all. But here are some non-starters in this, okay? 2 or 3 non-starters in this. First of all, I don't think we allow ourselves and can allow ourselves to become obsessed with it all. Being obsessed in the sense of getting so caught up in our burdens or these things that are before us that nothing else in life or very little else in life matters to us at all. That's a non-starter. And I say it's a non-starter because it'll kill you. It'll kill me. We were never intended to be obsessed with anything, whether it's good or bad in this world. We were never intended. As a matter of fact, obsession is a form of idolatry. That might sound weird to you. An idol is anything that has power over us other than Jesus. And an obsession has power over us. That, by definition, look it up in the dictionary, by definition, an obsession is something over which we have no control. It's different, by the way, from passion. Okay? Passion is a good thing. To be passionate about something, to be passionate about a vision, to be passionate about some action that we are taking, that's a different thing altogether and is a good thing. So being obsessed is a non-starter. Being indifferent to everything is also a non-starter. Being indifferent in the sense that we just don't care, we turn a blind eye to it, we stick our heads in the sand and we don't want to hear about it, we plug our ears, don't tell me about this, I don't want to see this, we just want to live our lives. That's a non-starter, especially for believers. Because, friends, we as believers have a responsibility as God's people in this world, as salt and light in this world, to address, for example, in our day and age, this racism, this systemic racism that's in the world. We have a responsibility to address that, stand against it. We cannot ignore it and hide our heads in the sand and be called God's people in this world because we're salt and light. Indifference is a non-starter. The other non-starter, I believe, is to be automatically jumping on the world's bandwagon on these issues. The temptation is to do that. Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't hitch your wagon, in other words, to what the world is doing or how the world is handling this. Yes, of course, if what the world is doing is right and good and just and loving, affirm it. Be a part of it. But don't sell your soul to the ways of the world. Remember the fact that while you are in this world, you are not of this world. Remember the fact that we as believers, we need to test and try the spirits. And there's a lot of ungodly spirits out there. A lot of evil spirits out there. There's a good spirit. Let me just give you an example in this racism issue. There's a good spirit out there that is rising up to protest the systemic racism. A good spirit to change things, to see change happen. There's a good spirit, but there's a bad spirit mixed in with it. And to me, we see that, for example, in the calls to, defund the police or abolish the police. Where does that come from? That comes from some corner that wants chaos in this world, not peace. So we need to discern the spirits. We need to discern what's going on out there. Does that make sense to you? So here's the thing that Jesus says that helps us in this. It's in John chapter 5. Jesus here is defending himself against the accusations that he was working on the Sabbath. Actually, he just healed someone, of all things. And in the midst of his defense of that, here's what he says. Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. I want to suggest to you that the guiding light for us in what we do about the burdens that we are carrying is to follow Jesus' example and do only what we see our Father doing. Why? Because the only thing that the Father will be doing is what is right, what is just, what is loving, what is peaceful. Do only what we see our Father doing. And how do we discern that? Well, it takes prayer. Not just praying about these things, but yes, praying about these things. But I'm talking about the communion with the Lord, the closeness to the Lord, so that we know his heart and we hear him speaking to us by his Spirit in terms of these specific things that are in our lives, to listen to him. So it requires prayer. It requires discernment, as I've already said, simply because, the enemy himself goes about robed as an angel of light. It requires discernment. It requires faith, because once we know what our Father wants us to do, we need to partner with Jesus in doing it. We need to believe that Jesus is working through us and working with us, and we're not in this alone. It requires faith. And then finally, it requires courage, because the world doesn't like Jesus. Did you hear that? It requires courage because the world doesn't like Jesus. And it will push back against truth, against righteousness, against Jesus. And so it takes courage. What do we do about those burdens? Do only what we see our Father doing. That's a guiding light for us. Come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, Jesus said. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And then he said, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does.